Grace was born completely blind. She has never seen a color, a shape, an object, anything. She gets around by touching and hearing. In order to identify and differentiate between objects, she runs her hand across their surfaces. Grace is also very superstitious. For good luck, she always carries with her a lucky marble and lucky die. Depending on the situation, she often takes one of them out and rubs it in her hand. She can differentiate between the die and the marble by feeling the die's pointed corners versus the marble's round surface. At 18 years old, Grace undergoes cataract removal surgery and an intraocular lens implant. Her blindness is effectively cured. She awakes from the surgery, and for the first time in her life, she sees the world around her. All the colors and shapes of objects previously known to her only by touch and language. On the table next to the hospital bed are her lucky marble and lucky die. In this moment, she wants to hold her lucky marble. She looks at both items on the table. Before touching them, can she tell which is which? Can she tell the marble from the die, having only touched it but never having seen it? This question is what is known as Molyneux's problem, originally formulated by philosopher William Molyneux in 1688. Intuitively, it might seem obvious to assume that Grace will be able to connect the smoothness she's touched in the past to the rounded appearance of the spherical marble and the pointedness she's felt to the angular appearance of the cubic die. But without any prior visual experience, without any reference point for what smoothness or pointedness or anything looks like, how would she be able to make these connections? For hundreds of years, versions of this thought experiment have divided philosophers. Empiricists, who support the theory that all knowledge is based on experience derived from the senses, believed someone in this situation would not be able to identify the objects because knowledge comes from first-hand sense experiences, which in this case have not yet been had. Rationalists, who base their opinions and actions on reason and knowledge rather than belief or emotion, believe that the person would be able to identify the objects because knowledge chiefly comes from our ability to reason, and the connections would be able to be deduced through one's rational faculties. Nowadays, modern science allows for the possibility of this thought experiment to not just be debated over, but actually tested. In 2011, MIT professors Dr. Pawan Sinha and Richard Held conducted an experiment in which a group of children and teenagers who were born blind were cured of their blindness through cataract removal surgery. Just following their surgery, these children were then presented with Lego-like blocks. One collection of blocks was placed visibly on a table, and another identical collection was placed hidden from view under the table, only perceivable by touch. When the participants were asked to match objects they had felt with objects seen, the results were essentially equivalent to chance, with 58% accuracy. In other words, Grace would not dependably identify the marble or the die. The experiment concluded that the empiricists were right. The primary tool we have to transfer information from the outside world into knowledge and understanding inside our head is our senses, not our ability to reason. This study is not without critiques though, and some argue that since there are a variety of other factors involved, for example, the surgery's recovery process from the time participants were tested after it, the problem is still inconclusive. Regardless, Molyneux's problem points to a broader problem, our first unanswerable philosophical question. How do we know that what we are perceiving is accurate? If we come to understand the world not primarily through reason, but through our sense experiences, how accurate are our perceptions and understandings if our senses are limited and often unreliable? Most of us assume that what we are encountering out in the world is relatively consistent with how we perceive it inside our heads. But how do we know? And can we ever know for sure? Qualia is a philosophical term used to refer to sensory experiences that have distinctive subjective qualities but lack any meaning or external reference to the objects or events that cause them, such as the painfulness of pinpricks, the redness of red roses, taste and feelings, love, sharpness, smoothness, and so on. So, whether or not what we are perceiving is accurate to the world in and of itself depends largely on whether or not qualia or our subjective experiences are intrinsic properties of the world or merely a product of the mind, or some combination of both. Even if we can use tools to measure, test, and enhance our insights about the physical world, the last stop for everything is still the mind. We are always left with and limited by the cognitive and perceptual frameworks inbuilt in the mind. Since we can never experience anything outside of the mind, including the mind itself, we can never know what anything is actually like outside of it. This is often referred to as the egocentric predicament. This leads us to the next question. How do we know that what we are perceiving is the same as other people? Since we can never experience anything outside of our mind, we can also never enter into another person's to know what things are like for them. Not only can we not know if the experience of blue is entirely unique to the human mind, but we also can't know if the specific blue we personally experience is unique to our mind alone, or at least is different from what is experienced in some portion of other minds. Since we can communicate relatively successfully about events and objects in the world, we can know that differences amongst objects and events outside our mind are generally proportionally consistent with differences experienced inside our mind. But just because we refer to the differences with the same terms does not mean that the differences are experienced as the same thing. Perhaps what you see as green looks like blue in your friend's mind, and vice versa, but you just associate the same words with the same differences. Because all qualia are housed in the conscious private mind, we can never objectively perceive, measure, or define them without using tools or terminology that don't also fall victim to the same problem. This leads us to the next unanswerable question. How do we know that anything or anyone exists outside our mind at all? If you can never get out of your mind and experience anything outside of it, and you can never enter into the mind of anyone else, how can you know for sure that anything or anyone exists outside of your mind? We reasonably assume that since the world interfaces back with us, objects and people respond to our actions, people talk and act like they feel and think things, and so on, that all of these things are real, independent things outside of our mind. But how can you know for sure that those people and things aren't merely creations of your mind? You do this every night when you dream without question. Can you prove right now that you are not on some sort of spaceship huddling throughout the cosmos, a member of an advanced species that has sent itself off on a long journey to avoid a catastrophe happening on its host planet? The only way to make the duration of the journey endurable was to be placed in a stasis tube with wires plugged into your brain, temporarily clearing all memories and stimulating your brain's nerve impulses throughout the trip in order to create a lifetime worth of experiences until arriving somewhere else and remembering it was all a simulated reality. Now obviously, odds are arguably very unlikely that this or anything similar is the case, but the point is the odds are not zero and you simply cannot know for sure. Although you can never know for certain about anything that exists outside your mind, the one thing you can know for sure is that you exist somewhere in some form. As philosopher René Descartes pointed out, if you can think and doubt, you must exist. But then where did you come from? Even if what you perceive isn't real, there still seemingly needs to be something other than yourself that created you and simulates, causes, or implants what you perceive. If you in some form exist, you must either be the creator of yourself or something else must have created you. If we assume the more likely and normal belief that other things and other people do exist and you were created by other people, then those who created you must also have been created by something or someone else, and whoever created them again must have been created by someone or something else, and so on and so forth, all the way back to the beginning of humanity, the beginning of life, the beginning of Earth, and the beginning of everything. And so, no matter the case, where did it all come from? If something or someone created everything, who created it or them? If everything came from nothing, how could it have come to be at all? This brings us to a final unanswered and possibly unanswerable philosophical question. Does God exist? God means different things to different people, but in terms of what is traditionally considered God, defined in all three of the Abrahamic religious texts, the three major religions that historically base their existence around the figure Abraham, the Bible, the Torah, and the Quran, there are a few problems. In these religions, God is defined as omniscient, which means He is all-knowing, aware of everything that has ever happened, is happening, will happen. He is omnipotent, all-powerful, possessing unlimited power and able to do anything. Omnibenevolent, He is all good, possessing maximal morality. The problem here is the multitude of paradoxes that arise from these qualities. Paradox is a self-contradictory statement which at first seems possible or true. For example, the classic omnipotence paradox, also commonly known as the paradox of the stone, which states that if God is omnipotent, He must be able to create a stone so large and heavy that even He cannot lift it. If He can't create such a stone, how can He be omnipotent? If He creates the stone and cannot lift it, how can He be omnipotent? Hence the paradox. Similarly, if God knows everything that will happen, then He knows every choice, every intervention and action He will ever make. Thus, He can never change His mind. If He does change His mind and is omniscient, He must have known that He was going to change His mind beforehand, and therefore He wouldn't be changing His mind. If He didn't know He was going to change His mind, He must not be omniscient. If He can't change His mind, He must not be omnipotent. And lastly, there's what is known as the problem of evil, which is defined as follows. If God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, why does tragedy and suffering pervade the world? If God is omnipotent, He must be able to prevent evil and suffering. If He is also omniscient, He must be able to know and foresee it. And so, He either wants to prevent evil, but He's not able to do so, or He's not aware of it, or He is aware of it and can do so, but does not want to prevent it. In the former, He is not all-powerful, or not all-knowing, or both. In the latter, He is not all-good. One argues that God provides the individual with free will so as to allow the individual to choose to follow Him or not. The fact that He is omniscient and is aware of everything would already include knowledge of the individual's action and choices, thereby not making anything a choice but rather a victim of a premeditated script in which they had no real choice but to fulfill said script. Besides, for what reason would God cause and allow individuals to not choose to follow Him or be morally good if it meant that they would cause evil and suffering? If these instances are rather some sort of test, why would an all-knowing, all-powerful God need to make people undergo tests involving horrible evil and suffering if He can create a flourishing world without the need for tests involving horrible evil and suffering? He must work in mysterious, sadistic ways. Of course, it could also be possible that God is maximally great but not all-powerful, or is not omniscient and is not aware of what's going on, or He isn't all good but rather He is morally fallible. God, or the creator of everything, or perhaps more accurately, the underlying nature of everything, could be something entirely different, completely beyond our ability to imagine, let alone define. The point is, we don't know. In truth, we cannot prove the existence of any God any more than we can disprove the one the many claim to know. Currently, the only honest answer is we don't know. Ultimately, we can't get out of our minds to know what the universe is really like in and of itself. We often view ourselves as a distinct and separate thing perceiving other things. We see ourselves as being in the mind and our mind as being in the body. But what if all of these things, the body and mind, are simultaneously interlocked and interdependent? What if there is really no outside of you, with you being a fully embedded, non-separate part of the universe? If we view ourselves this way, there is no right or wrong, accurate or inaccurate perception between the world as it is and the world as you experience it. No beginning, no end, no outside, no inside, just a single unified whole of everything. Everything equally true, equally proportional, eternally dancing, the dance of everything to the tune of nothing. To doubt the existence of anything outside of you is perhaps entirely reasonable, because in this sense you are everything else and everything else is you.